it's a very interesting Gen X storyline of like the exuberance of the .com, and then the ups and downs of that, and then after that having to sort of like build a real business, like or like just go down to the fundamentals. But between the two, because I hear you about the sort of a theme that I keep seeing in your life story is reinvention. You seem to constantly be reinventing yourself, and you sort of went through that first big sort of, let's call it, failure, and with all the sort of the social aspects of that as well. And to me, that's a very interesting theme that I want to hear you talk about a little bit, is the whole idea of failure or risk, or I mean, maybe because of the school system, maybe because of parenting styles, or maybe just like scarcity mindset. A lot of us are raised with a paralyzing fear of failure, and it's hard to take on a certain level of risk or adventure when we're stuck in these fears. I mean, who knows what people could do if they weren't so scared of failure, right? And very, very often this expresses itself as a sensitivity to negative talk around them. So the social aspect of failure as well, right? People tell you you shouldn't do this, or you can't do this, or you don't have the experience, or you don't have the schooling. You talk in your TED Talk about people who lose their jobs and who need to reinvent themselves, but they don't have the courage, or they don't feel like they have the schooling, they don't feel like they have the background for it. How do you frame, and especially like this sort of moment in your life when you had to kind of rebuild yourself along more, let's call it, more fundamental lines, or you had to gain more self-awareness? How do you kind of frame the issue of risk and failure? And as part of that also, how do you deal with the social aspects of people telling you you can't, or you shouldn't, or this is not for you?
Yeah, all good questions, because this is so, particularly like right now. I mean, it used to be this sort of mythology of a career where you would get good grades in school, you'd go to a good college, you'd get good grades in college, you'd go to a graduate school, and then you would get a job at a good company, or maybe you'd be a doctor or lawyer, and eventually you'd rise up, and after many years, you would retire and have enough money saved. And this was like the American dream. And risk was not, risk was sort of carved out of that equation. Like, all you needed to do was what I just said, and you would have this riskless career heading into a nice retirement. And of course, that myth was never true. And it's even less true now. I mean, but even back then, if there was a recession, doesn't matter how loyal your company was, you were going to get laid off. And then what were you going to do? And I would say the economy is far bigger and far greater now than it ever was before, even though, we have our certain problems now. The problems always seem bigger than they are when you take a historical view. But there's so much change that happens in people's careers now. People turn over jobs much more frequently. They turn over entire careers and industries, and there's many more startups, because the cost of doing a startup has gone down considerably. Like, you needed to raise millions of dollars in a few years ago to make a big website. Now you could ask ChatGPT to make the website for you, and then use WordPress with millions of templates, and use Gumroad to do your e-commerce, and Substack to manage your email list, and on and on. There's so many opportunities to create entirely unique and new businesses for almost $0. And that's really what's wonderful for experimenting. But in terms of risk and career, I think at times I've managed that well. At times I haven't managed it well. But risk is the most important thing entrepreneurs need to think about. Really, anybody, but we'll talk about entrepreneurship, because it's not having a great idea, though. It's very important. It's not that easy to have a great idea, and of course to do experiments to validate that your idea is correct. But once you have the idea and once you start your business, the only thing the entrepreneur should really be concerned with after that is risk. Because, again, I'll use poker as an analogy. The key to being successful at poker or as an investor is to simply stay in the game as long as possible. And you do that by mitigating risks. So, one way to mitigate a risk as an entrepreneur is, you have an idea for a product. Maybe don't raise $2 million to make the product. Why don't you do a service first? So sometimes, like for instance, I made websites for companies. Well, later on, there were products that made websites for companies like WordPress and so on. But since I didn't have any money to start with, and I wrote a lot of software myself to help me make websites, but I was a service business and I was profitable from day one. And if a client ever fired me, if one of my customers fired me, then I would, have to scale back employees. But that was my main risk. I never really was in risk of going out of business as long as I had even one client left. But so because a service business, you don't have to spend all this money up front making a product, or where you could then bleed to death by not selling your product. I only hired people when I had clients. Fortunately, at that time, I never really had to scale back because more and more companies needed websites. So it was a good business to be in. That, of course, is another way to mitigate risk, is find an industry that's growing exponentially, and that minimizes risk considerably. If I was going to go into the air conditioning business, believe it or not, that's a lot more risky than in the 1990s going into the making websites business. Although for many people, it didn't seem that way because the internet seemed risky. But there are so many ways as an entrepreneur to mitigate risk. Maybe take the podcast business. You built up an entire community of people interested in entrepreneurship. That gives you comfort that you could start a podcast and have listeners pre-baked into this. And then you could call advertisers and say, I have this community. Maybe you could be interested in advertising, or however, you develop your podcast. Again, mitigating risk is the key. And that's the main thing I've probably learned from failing so many times, is that you have to figure out what techniques to use to mitigate risk. So here's a valuable technique. When you tell an idea to someone, most people are going to say to you, oh yeah, that's a great idea. Go for it. You should really do that. That sounds really great. I would use that product if you made it. All your friends tell you that, and even some people not your friends. But that's not valuable information. That is useless. That's almost placebo information, because you make the product and guess what? Oh, I was planning on buying it, but I'm buying this other thing this year. I'll buy your thing next year, or whatever. Yeah. Everybody will have excuses. So you don't really know anything when people give you positive feedback. But if someone says, I would not use what you're describing, then you could ask why. And they say, well, it seems really hard for me. I'm not like, what do I need this product for when I already spend 24 hours a day with other products? Why are you going to now give me a new product? Or whatever. I have one friend, he had an experience where he developed a software that detects viruses, and his roommate from college was the decision maker, the CTO of a major top 5 internet company. He goes to CTO, they bring out all their people in the tech group. He brings all his employees, and the CTO of this major internet company says, oh my gosh, if we had your software, it would save us $40 million a year. If you just include these features, we'll buy it. So he goes back, he raises money, he includes those features, he goes back to one of his best friends who's the CTO, and the guy says, oh, it's not in our budget for this year, call us next year. And of course, the guy never bought it. And it's because he had other things he was buying that would save him $50 million a year instead of $40 million a year. And, again, negative feedback is a valuable tool that people don't take advantage of to, let's say you've been into real estate, right? Fred, you're a real estate person.
A little bit.
And so if you're, let's say you're a real estate agent and you're selling a house, and everyone passes through and say, oh yeah, we love this. We'll let you know. We'll call you. It looks very good. We love it. Of course, they never call. But if someone says, you know what? I just went out back. The basement is filled with rats or whatever. Now you have something you can deal with. You can mitigate the risk. You can remove the rats from the basement or find out why they're there. And now you've mitigated risk. And that's why negative information is more valuable than positive information.
I love that.
Why doesn't somebody use something?
Yeah. Negative feedback is huge. People today, we want positive reinforcement, positive feedback only. But you're right. In the positive feedback, there could be not lies, but I mean, you can sort of make reality more pleasant than it actually is. Whereas the negativity, at least you have a little bit of truth in there. So I've heard that in negotiation tactics as well. When the person tells you no, when you're trying to close a deal, the person is telling you no. That's an opportunity for them to tell you the truth. also reminds me of a piece of advice I heard from Bill Gross, who's a guy who's built multiple unicorns. And at some point I was in an event where he was talking, and somebody in the crowd asked him, like, how do you innovate? So how have you built so many innovative companies? Where do you get all these innovative ideas? And he says, without a doubt, our number one source of innovative ideas was always the place where companies are taught to sort of neglect or look away from, and that is customer complaints. Customer complaints is the place where you will get all of the ideas for product innovation that you'll ever need, because your customers are telling you, they're giving you negative feedback. That negative feedback has a lot of information in there, how you can make the product better, how you can make the user experience better. So I think that's a really important lesson for entrepreneurs. I think today there's a lot of the environment tends to slant very positive around like entrepreneurship stuff online, because we all want to feel good. We all want to give positive feedback. But the negative feedback is really, really important to sort of listen to as well, because you'll get a lot of, and I think if you approach it as a learner, as you clearly do with your experimental freewheeling approach, you'll kind of look at everything as a test and everything as an experiment. The failure, right, which you've talked about also, like Thomas Edison, he didn't fail 10,000 ways. He just learned 10,000 ways that didn't work to find the one way that does work. It's the same sort of almost like empirical scientist mindset of no experiment is lost. When you haven't succeeded at something, that is extremely valuable information that you can then use to kind of design your next experiment.
And by the way, the technique you just described of you looking at reviews, what are the customer complaints? This is a great way if you're thinking of writing a book. Look at the category that you're interested in writing a book for, and look at the reviews for every book that's kind of a bestseller in that category, and see what the readers don't like about the book. So here's a book that's already a bestseller, but some readers don't like X, Y, and Z. Well, now write a book that includes X, Y, and Z, and you've got better than a bestseller.
Wow,
so
that's a cool idea.
So it almost seems like when you say, "Oh, get negative information," to me, it almost seems like, "Oh, don't have any ideas until people start shooting things down." But you can have ideas and start experimenting. Like I said, let's use the book example. Write an article, see what people say about the article. Did it get a lot of engagement? That's a good thing, because it's very active. It's not just people saying good job. It's like by the way, if people just like an article, that's not good information. That's like everybody telling you, hey, go for it. Sounds good. But if people retweet or reshare, or you can see that they're sending it to their friends, then that's valuable information because they're actually doing something. But negative information, again, is even more valuable. Oh, I love this, but you didn't I wish you had talked about this, this, and this. Oh, you talked about negotiating, but what about these other techniques? I would love to hear about that. And so here you're doing an experiment. Instead of writing an entire book, you're writing an article, and then you're looking for the negative comments to see what you could learn from them. I did a book once called The Power of No, and it's probably behind me somewhere. And it was, and what I did was I wrote an article first called The Power of No. And I described, maybe in this article, I described 10 ways you could say, I'm very bad at saying no to things. And so I had to learn. And that's usually the case with entrepreneurship or book writing or anything, is that first something's very difficult, and then you solve the problem, and now you have knowledge, which you can either use to make a company or write a book or whatever it is. So saying no is very difficult for me. So I wrote an article, which was my story of how I learned to say no. And it got a huge amount of engagement. So that gave me confidence. Okay, this is going to be a good book. And people specifically offered their own ideas too. Like, this is how I say no. This is how I say no. So that gave me information about things I didn't include that I could try for myself, and then write that story and include that in the book. And that book was a major bestseller.
That's really cool. So how, I'm interested in your process of how you set up. You talk about your 100 experiment strategy. When you start being really interested in something, you'll just do a bunch of experiments and start to learn from them. How do you set that up? How formally do you set it up in order to extract the learning? Or is it just, I almost get a sense with you that you're constantly trying a million things, but do you also layer in a little bit of order in that process? Where like, okay, this is what I'm trying to test. I'm trying to write a book. Okay, so you do sort of sequence it logically to kind of, you set it up for learning, right? You're not just like,
As much as you possibly can. I mean, it's with each domain in life, it's a little different. Like writing a book is a great example because you could first write a tweet and then you could write an article and you could write more than one article, by the way. And so you could just test different ideas that are going to be included in the book, different stories, which stories were interesting to people, which stories were not interesting to people, which concepts were interesting to people, and so on. But like there was one period, and this is kind of, I've done, like you said, my career has sort of been a roller coaster, and that's really for better or for worse. Sometimes I look back and I say to myself, I wish I had just had one interest that I loved the whole time and, pursued that, because is a danger of becoming a jack of all trades, master of none. But there was a 6-year period where every night, pretty much 7 nights a week, I would go up on stage and do stand-up comedy. And to the point where I owned part of a comedy club, and I got really just obsessed with comedy. I would watch comedy all day. I would write comedy. And so there's a lot of ways you can experiment in comedy. So for instance, I was having trouble with one-liners and just coming up with really quick comebacks. And so I went on a New York City subway, which is probably the most unfriendly audience you could have, because they're just trying to get home from work. They don't want to hear some guy making bad jokes. And I would do, from one stop to the next, I would try to do an entire set of comedy, and then I would switch cars on the next stop and do it again. And I videotaped myself. I mean, I had someone follow around and videotape, and then I was able to look at it later. Okay, what types of one-liners were working for me? What wasn't? What type of behavior was working for me? What type of engagement with people was working for me? What wasn't working? And by the way, and this was an experiment, I figured, hey, this was kind of interesting. This was almost like a late night talk show. I had this audience on a New York City subway. What else is in a late night talk show? Well, there's usually a celebrity guest and a musical guest. So I had a friend of mine who had just written a book. I had him come on the subway with me, and I interviewed him on the subway. And then we talked to other people sitting around us, what they thought of this person. And then I found a guy who was busking, just hitting like garbage cans, like drums in the subway. He was really good at it. And so I had a musical guest. And so this experiment turned into, a 20-minute video that I packaged as a late night show. And I sent to an agent, and he said, not interested, but that's fine. That was an experiment of making my own late night TV show with this unusual format, just, kind of like a late night show, but you just switch a couple of things and now it's like your own version of a late night show.
Yeah.
And it didn't cost me anything. And I had a whole package I could send to an agent. It didn't work out, but in some other universe, maybe it could work out. And that was an experiment that in a variety of ways that I was able to, and by the way, at the very least, I have a story to tell. And that was the result of all those, the whole thing was a failure. Very few people laughed at my jokes, and I didn't get to make a show, but I learned something about comedy, and I have a story to tell.
Yeah, like sometimes the skills that you acquire, right, you'll be able to use in another context. And that's what that jack of all trades approach. I mean, we're taught in the school system, in a lot of ways, your approach is almost diametrically opposed to what we're taught in the school system, which is essentially like learn via regurgitation, or like just a set, like a series of tasks that you're supposed to execute in one particular way. And then you kind of specialize, right? You just get better and better at a narrower set of things. Your approach in a lot of ways is the opposite of that. It's like, you know what? I'm just going to like keep experimenting, learn, pick up skills all over the place, pick up knowledge all over the place. And then eventually you might, use that productively for, a business or something. But I have a feeling there's also a little bit of fun. Like you're also, right? Like you using kind of the passion as a North Star for deciding whether you want to do something or not. How much of it is like, okay, it needs to turn into a business, needs to turn into a show? And how much of it is also like, you're having fun along the way also?
Well, that's a good question. And I think sometimes I've, focused too much on the things I love instead of, particularly early on, like, I have to keep thinking about making money and building a business and so on. Like sometimes I get too obsessed with what I love. I'm willing to sacrifice a lot. You have to always keep a balance in life between, your family life, your career life, and the things you love. And hopefully they all can intersect sometimes, but they're not always going to intersect. And I think I was, particularly during those comedy years, I always wonder, what if I had just focused on, investing in businesses and starting businesses? Maybe, I would have made my own Uber or whatever, but I didn't do that. I just focused on comedy to the suppression of everything else. And sometimes that works out. Like, I've been a writer for a very long time, and that always in my down moments, I've had a consistent cash flow from writing. And, but I love pursuing things I'm passionate about. And you're right. When you learn a new set of skills, or even when you start to master something, it translates into other areas of your life. So for instance, if I have to give a talk to a very corporate talk about entrepreneurship or leadership or negotiation or sales or whatever, I would say now I'm about 10 times better than I used to be, because I, for 6 years, did stand-up comedy every night. Stand-up comedians are probably, in some ways, the best public speakers. They know how to move, they know how to speak, they know how to tell stories, and they know the right moments to pause and be funny. So just even a tiny bit of comedy skills are able to help with public speaking. And this is an important thing too. You don't have to be the best in the world at everything you do. A lot of people, they won't do something unless they can be the best in the world at it. But it's very easy to learn the skills to be in the top 1% of the world. So let's take a game like chess, for instance. There's 600 million people around the world who play chess. So to be in the top 1%, you have to be in the top 6 million chess players, which, okay, get a coach for a few months, read a book or read some books and do some studies. You'll get into the top 1 or 2%. And that means you're better at this one thing than anybody you know. And it's worthwhile to get good at things, because then it helps you to stand out. I'll give you an example. One of my daughters was having trouble getting into college. And by the way, I was against all my daughters or all my kids going to college. I'm not a big believer in the benefits right now of college education versus the cost and the time, but just having trouble getting into college. So I said, why don't we try something? Instead of you trying to compete to get into whatever college, that you're having trouble getting into, take a year off and do some interesting things. So I said, you could maybe you could take chess lessons, you could travel, you could work for some charity, you could take race car driving lessons. There's not many women in race car driving, professional race car driving, and on and on. We came up with some ideas together, and she decided, okay, I'm going to get race car driving lessons, which cost almost nothing. She got a professional race car driver's license, participated in some races. Guess what? A year later, she got into every single school like that she applied to. So if you stand out, you become simply in the top 1% of something, and then you stand out, you're different. And that's what people want, different. Better to be the only than the best. And that's a very important thing.